Today I'm speaking with David Ames. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And this is a true privilege for me because you're one of the people that I consider like a coworker or a friend in arms, colleague in arms, because you're doing something very similar to what I'm doing. We'll get into that more, so I don't want to spoil all the whole story of that too soon. But you are the host of the Graceful Atheist podcast, which is just awesome. Yours is audio without the video and a little bit more anonymous for your viewers. But I'd love to hear more about that in a few minutes. But
Mhm.
again, you're the host of the Graceful Atheist podcast. So everyone who's watching, please go like and subscribe. I'll have the links beneath this video. He interviews people there who have experienced faith transitions from doubt to deconstruction to deconversion. So that's really awesome. And they talk, of course, about other topics like secular grace, humanism, and other big questions in life. David Ames is on the West Coast and he works in the tech industry. So, besides what I know about you so far, can you tell us more about yourself and maybe a few fun things too?
Yeah, I've got two adult kids. I've got a wonderful wife who is still a Christian. That may be an interesting subject we can get into. Very much still a Christian.
Mm,
Uh, I am a runner, which is kind of tedious and boring, but I enjoy it quite a bit. It's something that gives me a lot of mental health benefits as well as the physical benefits. We'll get into my story, but I just enjoy talking to people and doing this kind of thing, both on this side of the interviewer's desk and the other. It's just something I really, really enjoy.
that's awesome. How long, by the way, have you been doing the podcast?
The podcast started in 2019, so
Okay.
we're coming up on 5 years.
Okay, very good.
Yeah,
I was maybe 6 months, 12 months behind you with starting mine
yeah,
here with the Harmonic Atheist, but that's awesome. Well, at this point, I'd love to pass the ball to you to kind of tell your story. How did you get involved with Christianity?
yeah. So I often say that I was in a nominally Christian home, and I mean really nominally. I joke that, quoting Douglas Adams, I would ask my family, "So who is this God character anyway?" I was very curious, and my mom and my grandmother in particular would talk about God quite a bit. I had a great grandmother who was a very severe Methodist lady, who would talk about her Christianity as well, but it was very distant, very remote and cold. uh, with my grandmother and my mom, it felt like they had something that I wasn't sure what that was, but they did not go to church. And a lot of my family story is the fact that my mother was also an addict, both drugs and alcohol, and that's a whole part of the story here.
Hmm.
But long story short, I asked a lot of questions, but my experiences of Christianity were really poor. It was just you're going to hell because you're sleeping with your girlfriend kind of stuff, and I was not interested. Uh, and then, as I mentioned, my mom was an addict. One day, she comes to me and she says, "Dave, I'm I'm going to be clean and sober. Jesus told me to stop drinking," and I was like, "Great, that's fine, okay."
Wow.
And the next day, she was clean. The next day after that, she eventually went to a rehab that was, reasonably successful. There were some bumps along the way, but eventually, she just had this dramatic epiphany and became a very dedicated Christian at that point.
Hmm.
I have to say that she was really good in that she didn't force this on me in any way. She handed me a Bible and said, "If you're interested, you might want to look into this." And this is again a part of my story. I wound up reading through that Bible over approximately a year, something like that, before I'd really stepped into church. I'd been to church before. It's not like I was completely ignorant. Here and there, that kind of thing, but never as as a member or attending for any length of time at all. And so one of the interesting experiences for me was reading the Bible, really falling in love with Jesus. Here is, I came to for the sick and not the well. That just deeply spoke to me. And I think the 12-step influence as well, and my mom's recovery and being around recovering addicts. Grace was just a big deal. I don't know that they always had the language for that, but that was just really important to me. So the Jesus that I saw in the New Testament, particularly parts of the Sermon on the Mount, just really deeply spoke to me. And I wanted to be a Christian. And so uh, my mom and I began to look for churches. And my first experience in church, I had at the time, this is the 80s. I'm pretty old. Had long hair and an earring, and was very much
Nice.
looked askance. All
What
that.
age was this again?
I was probably 17, 18, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
That's a pretty
uh,
pivotal part of time of life.
yes.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, they basically, I think I must have been 18 or 19 at this point. Sorry. By the time we were going to church. They had no idea what to do with me. So they were like, why don't you help out with the youth group? So the youth pastor took me under my wing as if I were in the youth group rather than too old to be there. And he was really one of the people who said, you could do this for a living. You could be a pastor. And up to this point, part I haven't mentioned is I did drop out of high school. Things were not going when my mom got better, I got worse. It was that kind of thing. Like I had been trying to be the good kid up to that point, and then I was like, I'm done. and
Mm.
uh, so here's the first time that somebody was like, you could go to college. And so I really, even today, I'm very grateful to that youth pastor for giving me that encouragement because that even though there's the rest of the story, that was deeply significant. Winding up going to Bible college and really excelling, realizing I loved education. I had
Mm.
hated high school, but I loved college, and who knew? Um,
But at that
it's,
point, though, with the youth pastor interacting with you, were you actually a Christian yet at that point?
oh yeah, for sure, yeah, yeah. But so
Okay.
within a few months of starting to read the Bible, I would have called myself a Christian at that
Okay.
point. Yeah, yeah.
Do you mind just for
And
anyone that doesn't know what we're saying exactly, what did it mean for you to actually become a Christian?
yeah, again, grace was so important to me, and it was about accepting Jesus as a savior, as having paid for my sins, that I was a sinner at the time, and needed to be forgiven, and that I felt like accepting Jesus brought me to a relationship with the Father, and having the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So it was the whole nine. Uh, and I was really very much experiencing real life changes, watching my mom get clean and sober. Um, my life began to have a bit of purpose that it really did not have prior to that. So all of this was very deeply significant and personal. This was not my mom's faith. This was mine, 100%. And it took off from there, participating with the youth group and then again, eventually into Bible college.
Mm. And which Bible college did you go to?
A little college in California called Bethany, Bethany
Okay.
College at the time, Bethany University in the recent past, and since the 2007 or 8, it is no longer in existence, so
Oh,
it's not
interesting.
there anymore. But it was an Assemblies of God church and an
Okay.
Assemblies of God school.
Hmm. I don't know everything about the Assemblies of God Church that maybe I arguably should, but if based on your experience of other churches since then, what were the distinctives of that church? And I know that they are very charismatic typically. What were
Yeah,
the pressures that you faced? And like, did you have to speak in tongues, for example, to be saved, or like what was it the culture like?
yeah. Yeah, so it was not super high demand. It definitely that we spoke in tongues, and that was very highly encouraged. I never heard anyone say that you weren't saved if you didn't speak in tongues. The Assemblies of God has a lot of the holiness background in the church history, and then that charismatic element as well. So lots of you know occasionally people would prophecy, speaking in tongues. There was a focus on the gifts of the Spirit. Um, but to be fair to them, it was also what I would call, and I have a lot more experience now with a broad range of evangelical churches. It was very mainstream evangelical theology at the end of the day.
Hmm. So the Bible's inerrant and Christ alone, faith
That's
alone.
correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yes.
I'm just curious for a fun question to throw in here. Can you still speak in tongues?
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's absolutely a a physical a physical thing, and not in any way a spiritual thing. So yeah,
Would you call it a learned behavior?
absolutely,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, if you wanted me to tell that story, I was,
Yeah, for free.
for me, and obviously we know the rest of the story, it makes sense. I needed it to be true. I needed it to be real. And so I took a very long time for that to work. I was not the type of person who would sit in the middle of a group with a bunch of people with their hands on me and then speak in tongues in front of everyone. This was going to be personal between me and God. And so with that same youth pastor that I described earlier, I'd be talking back and forth about, what is it like? What should I expect? When do I know that it's real? And on my way to work one day, I was in the car by myself, and it was just starting. It was just saying a syllable, right? Putting it out there, and and then I have to admit that it was a profound experience. I mean, I cried. It felt like I was very close to God at that time. It felt very real at the time. So it was
Hmm.
not performance for me. I did this alone. This is not something that I did in front of people, and it felt very real at the time.
Hmm. It's amazing the way that our bodies hormones can just experience those things. Like you just really do tell yourself and trick yourself,
Yeah,
in my opinion, that this is God. I remember being it was a Newsboys concert probably way back in the day. Did you ever hear of
yeah.
Newsboys?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah,
And just something like tingled down my spine, like, oh my gosh, God's coming over me. And, I've now learned both, so much about what just the ambiance does, as well as the really loud music. The fact that
yeah,
you've got, 5, 10,000 people around you all doing the same thing with their hands raised, it does something to your
for sure.
hormones and to your mental state, but it you definitely feel something. It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I had very much, what I would describe as a personal relationship with Jesus, right? Like it in fact, I was critical of the performant elements that I was seeing within the church, where I felt like, that person's doing that for show. And for me, it really needed to be real and internal, and something that I really felt, I truly believed that God was doing.
Hmm. Did you feel, and you mentioned the youth pastor's words too before, but did you, as you kind of matured in your faith, did you feel a strong calling to be involved in ministry, or whether directly in the church or some kind of ministry of some kind?
Yeah. So, beginning with just that early volunteering, it turns out that not everybody had read their Bibles. And again, that experience of reading before I got there was interesting, because it was like, I don't know why they think this or that. Like the long hair thing. It's a dumb example, but like, where did that come from? Why would you care? Right? Like, that isn't in the Bible in any way. So I had lots of questions like that, of just babe in the woods, but with some knowledge, and so I saw very early that my ministry was reminding the church about the grace of God, that they were sinners and they needed God's grace too, even if they've been in that pew for 80 years, and that the the beauty of that relationship for me was the acknowledgement of my own need for God's grace, the sin side of it, and then the overwhelming sense of his love in return, his acceptance and forgiveness in return. And I just thought, oh, okay, they've just forgotten, and so this is what I need to teach, both to the youth group and to the church at large. So when the youth pastor was saying, you could do this, and you could go to Bible college, and I did. uh, I was on a trajectory. I thought in the beginning, I thought, well, I'll probably be an evangelist. There were definitely times at Bible college where a missionary would come through, and I would think, for sure, I'm going to be a missionary. Uh, I learned subsequently that, within the AG, missionaries have to raise their entire monetary support, and I knew I wasn't going to be good at that. That just isn't one of my skills. And I thought, okay, well, so I'm not going to be a missionary. um, Bible college, I say, was the best of times and the worst of times. Again, the educational side was amazing. I say my professors did too good a job. I think they taught
Hmm.
me really good critical thinking. They taught really good exegesis, hermeneutics, how to study the Bible, how to um, interpret that for the modern day. Uh, I loved it. I just ate it all up. I say that Jesus won my heart in the Gospels, and Paul won my mind. With the more systematic theology and the theology that is within the Pauline letters.
Mm.
Uh, so I mean, I thrived at to say that I thrived is an understatement at Bible college, and my peers recognized that. I would get asked to speak and things like that with my peers. So
Mm.
Bible college was amazing.
I can definitely do that too. It's amazing when you're like truly, I mean, I know Christians will always say people like us weren't real Christians, but like when you just love God truly with all your heart,
Yeah,
like you said, you're not trying to do a facade. You really truly love God. You want to give your life to Him, your mind to Him, be a clean vessel, holy, ready to serve Him and love Him, worship Him. And the Bible is your true, it's His love letter to us, and it's the first thing in the morning to the end of the night. Your mind is just, what can I glean from the Word of God so I can understand my creator and the lover of my soul better, and I
right.
can love him back. And when you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much, like, you knew the Bible was this treasure chest, but you're like, you realize you only saw the top layer, and you're like pulling this, like, oh my gosh, there's rubies this size, and
Yes,
it
yeah,
blows you away. And you're like,
yeah,
you can't give me enough fast enough. I want more. And
right,
I
right.
remember when I was at Bob Jones, I had this pastor you have to go to their chapel in the morning services and Sunday mornings, but on Sunday nights they let you pick a solid church in the area. And I picked this Baptist church, and this guy was literally the kind of preacher that he would preach for like 50 minutes straight, probably more than that.
Hmm.
And I'm used to like 20 solid minutes of preaching,
Yes,
maybe
yeah,
30 on a good day, but he'd preach on a regular basis in the evening for like 50 minutes, and probably more than that if I remember correctly. And I swear you would not want this man to stop. You'd be like, please do not tell me you'll finish this next week. I want to hear more
right.
right now. And it is. This is the word of God. It's that important.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And again, to just reiterate, I think the professors that I had were amazing. In particular, a systematic theology professor, a few biblical history professors, a hermeneutics professor that were just absolutely amazing. So
Mm.
the downside was that I say that it was infantilizing. Here I was, 19, 20 years old, and we were being treated like high school students and with curfews and just we were not adults. We were being treated as children. So like that was a downside. The the next kind of step that happens to me is again I had this very positive experience at Bible college, and then it became time to get licensed within my denomination. Uh, and then it was here is a statement of faith of I forget how many things it was, 12, let's say it's 12 things, but inerrancy is one of them. Uh, Lots of things that I agreed with, but several things that were deeply uncomfortable for me uh, to sign off on. And I really feel like I, this is not what I had been working for so long, and but from an integrity point of view, it felt wrong, and to this day, I feel like I should not have signed that document, and I did.
Mm.
So I went
Can I ask, do you happen
into
to remember any of the points, or is it too far gone?
not off the top of my head, but
Okay.
I think if you just grabbed, a statement of faith from an AG church, it'd probably be that, right?
Yeah.
Um, the specific things I think I was uncomfortable with were inerrancy, because again, I think my teachers did too good a job. So,
It's amazing.
uh, yeah, a few other things that are just escaping me at the moment, but uh, so I did go into ministry. I did back to that same church, youth pastor work. I was there for a couple of years. Uh, it was both, a positive experience with the people. I really enjoyed the people. I enjoyed speaking, but I was burning out. I was like, what I have come to discover about myself over the long term is that I really am an introvert. I really am good one on one, and I'm pretty bad in a large group. Um, and the pressures that, of course, any uh, pastor or someone in church leadership has are just tremendous, right? Uh, so things did not go great. I started a relationship with a mother in the youth group, That was a consensual adult relationship, but obviously that was frowned upon. And rather than face uh, the church discipline that they wanted to do, I knew I was done. I was done with church. Uh, so I walked away from ministry. And what's important to know here is that I did not walk away from God. This is 1997, something like that, 96, 97, somewhere in that neighborhood. So I was very, very dedicated still. And but I knew that ministry wasn't where my career could not be ministry in effect, right? And I
Hmm.
didn't know what that was going to be. Uh, Shortly thereafter, I got reacquainted with my college sweetheart, who I'm married to this day. So
That's
we got
awesome.
back together, and part of what we were bonding over was our experiences in leadership and the burnout, and then still being very dedicated Christians. In her case, nothing as untoward as mine, but just the regular pressures of church leadership there. So
Hmm.
we got married a few years later in roughly 2000. And so, I remained a Christian. We thought of ourselves as a Christian couple for a good 20 years. So a long time after leaving church ministry. Uh, and at some point in time, I began to have some more doubts, to be a little more honest with myself, and we can get into that now if you'd like to. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just going to add real quick one comment to what you said a few minutes ago about how your teachers did too good of a job.
Mhm.
I would say mine probably did too. I was just maybe too thick to pick up on putting the pieces together the way they should have been. But it is
Yeah.
interesting when you step back from it, that one of the things that I've reflected on this quite a bit over the years is I heard this phrase over and over. Before you claim that you can interpret a passage of scripture correctly, you have to have the context. So they're
Yes.
always saying, this verse is within this paragraph, which is within this chapter, which is within this
Right.
book, which is within this testament, or and so forth. And then all the other contextual things, who's writing it, where are they, what is the
Yeah.
audience, what language was it in, what was their culture like? And so it's like all this stuff of like, what is the context? And you cannot get it right if you don't have the context
Right.
accurate.
Yeah.
And yet, when you add in the true context of like, okay, let's look at Egyptian mythology,
Right.
Mesopotamian mythology, Zoroastrianism,
Yeah.
Greco-Roman mythology, all this comparative mythology stuff is like, oh, so there's more context. But the moment you bring in that context, it's like, oh no, we didn't mean that context. We just meant this
Right.
specific context. But
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
like it's crazy. They want you to think a certain way, but when you take that too far, it's by definition too far. So
Yeah.
it's crazy. Anyway, yeah, take us into the next stage of your journey.
Yeah. I want to make a comment on that too. The other thing that I always heard was a text cannot mean what it did not mean to the original author and the original hearers.
Mm.
And even just that really limits some interpretations of the Bible that many denominations have. And so, yeah, context is everything, obviously.
I think too, one of the since we're just quoting things that we used to hear a lot, I
Yeah, yeah,
remember thinking one of the big rules is you always interpret scripture with scripture. So if it clearly says this here, and then you get something over here that contradicts it, you the issue is not that it truly contradicts it, it's that you need to figure out, what God is saying with all of them.
right,
And it took me
right.
so long to realize, wait a second, they just simply contradict each other. Even
Exactly.
within the
Yes.
same book, sometimes it's which is probably not the same author, but or Paul's like, go ahead and sacrifice meat to idols. Who cares? It's,
Yeah.
there's no such thing as demons. Then like two chapters later, like, for goodness sake, don't do it. We don't
Yeah.
have anything to do with devils, the work
Yeah.
of devil. And it's like, it sounds like there's two people writing this. You put them into one book, but
Yes.
it's crazy the way and the whole,
Yeah.
what is it, harmony of the gospels, where you're
Yes.
trying to get all four together in one book. But it's amazing that I mean, it's a good point though to make, like when you're in it, especially for me, like I heard it from childhood, when you're in it long enough, it's just your blinders are on, your rose-colored glasses are on. The Bible can do no wrong. Your
Yeah.
pastor and the church can do no wrong. You just say, yes, sir, you're right. Thank you, Jesus. And it's just you keep moving on. You ignore the issues.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's a good segue. I feel like, with hindsight, I can see every time that I ignored my own questions or refused to follow those questions through to their ultimate conclusions. I've since obviously interviewed lots of people, just as you have, and there's a bunch of analogies for this of just setting things on a shelf. um, uh, exceptions to the rule of faith, I think, is uh, another author's concept. There's all these ways that it's the cognitive dissonance that we run into, and we know I can't deal with that right now. I'm going to deal with it later, and we just ignore it and move on. And again, with hindsight, I see that just throughout my life. So, uh,
I love your analogy too that you put on your website of the Jenga tower.
yes,
It's just
yeah, exactly. You're just pulling pieces out one at a time, and yeah. Again, a good segue. So that 20 years go by, where we found churches. We're attending churches. They tended to be more of the Baptist variety in that 20-year period, and less charismatic. Uh, but for me, I still thought of myself as a Christian. I was still witnessing to people. I talk about running. I'd bump into people and start telling them about Jesus. I mean, it's hard to get across. Like, I know Tim, but like the Christians in our lives say, well, you were never a real Christian. And I think, I don't know how, I don't know how I could have been more a real Christian. This was so deeply important to me throughout this whole time. Uh, Having said all that, doubts did start to creep in. And uh, at one point I was doing another read through the Bible, doing a year through the Bible kind of thing. And my wife started to comment to me like, you seem angry. Why are you angry? And I think it was one of the first times that I was reading it without the rose-colored glasses. So I was just hearing the text on its own, and in particular, lots of the prophets, some of the Old Testament it's rough, right? When you're not doing the analogy of faith, interpreting based on Christ and the future looking New Testament, and really just read what it says, it's daunting. It's difficult. And I think I was reading it in that light for the first time. And that was definitely the beginning of the end. um, I think around this time, I was also, I realized that church was wrong on LGBTQ issues. I knew I loved people who were gay, and it just, and again, the grace part of the gospel was overriding the holiness part of scripture. And I just thought people are more important than theology or holiness practices, that kind of thing. And uh, so I was deconstructing without having any idea what deconstruction is. Deconstructing the Bible, deconstructing church, but I was still hanging on to God. So in the last year, kind of the bitter end, I would have said at that time, I have the Cartesian sensus divinitatis, like alls I know is that God is, and that's all I could hang on to. And the Bible seems to be important, and but maybe not. It's definitely not inerrant, and uh, but it might be God speaking to us from the past in some way or another. But I was just barely hanging on by a thread, and uh, I in this time period, I began to let other things in. I reread some apologists, which was a mistake. We can get into that if you want, but
Yeah.
apologetics, I think, was a part of my loss of faith in that I realized those things that I had put on the shelf to say, I'll look at this later. When I began to look at them, the answers were terrible. They were really bad, such that I would say,
Hmm.
I believe the conclusion by faith, but this argument is bad. It is flawed. Uh, so that was part of the beginning of the end. And then the very end was I was beginning to read some atheist authors here and there, but I want to make clear here it wasn't that I read atheist authors and then became a non-Christian. It was that I was already headed that direction. Didn't know it, wasn't admitting it to myself. And the language, the ability to express what I was feeling was being written by these authors, right? So I was reading a Greta Christina article about the non-existence of the soul, the fact that we are physical beings and that things that affect our body chemistry or physically to our our brains, drastically can change personality, can change all of these things. And I knew that was true. I just knew that my body is me and I am my body. Uh, and so like I lost the sense of the soul. And then almost immediately after, I'd already been thinking about this a lot, but was why do I believe in the resurrection? It was all binary for me. The reason I hung on for as long as I did, that extra 20 some odd years, was I believed the resurrection had happened. I believed that Jesus was alive. And uh, and I started to ask myself with honesty, why do I believe that? I've been told this, the Bible says this, but why do I actually believe that? Right? Would I believe any other miracle claim of that magnitude in any way, shape, or form, particularly from a non-Christian faith? And the answer was solidly no. And I had to just accept uh, to myself that I no longer believed in the resurrection. And for me, that was it. That was game over. I was like, I'm an atheist now because for me, it was binary. I believe Paul when he says, uh, for if Christ is not risen, then we are of all men most to be pitied. Like it is on or off, binary, true or not. Uh, and I had this kind of, oh shit moment. Like, what am I going to do? I'm married to this beautiful Christian woman, and I want to remain married to her. And how am I going to tell her this? And so that we'll get to that in a second. But that was the next phase.
Hmm. Can I ask, do you recall any of the apologetics issues you were looking at to try to untangle some of those doubts and trying to get back to your place of stronger faith?
Yeah, so I think specifically I had read what led me to begin questioning apologetics was the focus on intelligent design. I had always been kind of a science nerd, pop science nerd, and so particularly while reading those, again, I agreed with the premise, with the conclusion that God was creator, and uh, but I was seeing how flawed the arguments were. That math wasn't quite right, the assumptions were wrong, there was missing data, just lots and lots of problems with intelligent design apologetics. And and so when I began to apply that to the resurrection, well, I believe in the resurrection because the New Testament says that Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, why do I accept that text as being true? And that just the house of cards began to fall down. I was aware of all of the arguments for why we should trust the New Testament and why the resurrection ought to be true. And in fact, after I deconverted, my best friend, who's still a Christian, said, I'm not going to ask you for very many things, but would you read um, The Case for Christ? And I was like, okay, sure. I think I'd read it before, but I reread it, and again, it had the exact opposite effect. It's very poorly argued. It is painful on this side. When you begin to be honest with yourself, and you no longer are able to fool yourself, that the flaws in these arguments are just obvious. They're self-evident. And so uh, it, again, it's like an example that I like to say is, I, I believe I believed at the time that Jesus was raised because, uh, because of my mom's personal experience, because my pastor said so, because the Bible said so. Uh, and if I take like who's the best theologian in the world at the time and ask them the same question, they'd say something, maybe not their mother, but like something very similar, the Bible, and someone great in their life, some great theologian in their lives told them. And if we just go back through the train, maybe we hit through Aquinas and, some of the heavy hitters, uh, Augustine, what have you, we get down to Paul at some point. Paul's story is, I saw a vision of Jesus. He didn't actually even see him physically. Uh, Even if we get to Jesus, like even if we accept the person Jesus and we have his words, let's say the red letters are right, that truly was stated by Jesus. He could be wrong. He could be mistaken as well. Liar, lunatic, or Lord is not a trilemma. He could be mistaken. We could be mistaken. And just accepting that and understanding that, you realize that it's all predicated on faith from the beginning. And if you begin to question faith, there is no ground to stand on. And
Mm.
so again, apologetics just had the opposite effect on me, both near the end and then after the end.
It's interesting. I can definitely relate to some of that. My journey was not as much the science side of it, and it's honestly, I wish I had dove into that more over the years, just because it's so fascinating. But mine was more the whole um, the atrocities in the name of
Yeah,
Yahweh. You know, God commanding
yeah,
all this stuff. And I've gone into a lot of the details of that on other interviews, but just when you step back from it all, and just to give a quick list, if people don't know what I'm talking about, it's like genocide, land theft, slavery, child bride, stoning,
yeah,
all speeding your slaves, passing slaves on to your children, all this kind of stuff. And when you add it all up, and then you look not just at the commands to the people who are the followers, but the actual character of Yahweh, you're like, so he commands you to forgive. For example, in the New Testament, he says, if you don't forgive, I'm not going to forgive you.
right,
Just like, so he really, really, really wants you to forgive. But then he says, with the hell passages, if you don't trust in Jesus, then you're going to burn forever. So like he doesn't really forgive forever. And then you get into some of the nitty gritty details of the Old Testament stories. And you're like, this guy's a whack job. Like he's really nasty. You'd
yeah,
never, if he was a real, like a human doing this stuff, he'd be in prison. And you're like, so I'm worshiping a criminal. The Satan character is more honorable than the Yahweh character by leaps and bounds.
yeah,
And I dove and did the same thing that you were talking about, but instead of looking at the science, I was like, I wonder what theologians say about, is God like a moral monster? Is he really a psychopath or not? And the same experience. People would give these explanations, and it basically amounted to, if you understood the white hot holiness of God and you understood the horribleness of sin and what it cost God to redeem you, to get over that, you would never question that. And then I was also bringing in Romans, what is it, 9, 10, 11, where people are arguing, about the whole election issue, like, God, if you knew you were going to condemn me, if you made me
mhm,
as this vessel of wrath, a clay pot that you knew you could destroy, and you intended to destroy me from the beginning, then why did you make me this way? And it never actually gives an answer. It just says, what's the clay pot going to do? Argue against the potter?
right,
Who are you to argue against God? And it's just like, those arguments, when you're real pious, they sound like, oh yeah. But when you really step back, you're like, that's really terrible. That's a horrible way to think through this thing. Like
yeah,
you can't defend it. Eventually that's what happens, is you're like, if you guys want to defend it, that's on you, but I can't defend this stuff anymore. That doesn't sound right to me.
yeah.
Did you have a hard time giving yourself the freedom to say this doesn't sound right?
Yeah. So up to that moment, exactly. I think I hung on for a very long time because I was not giving myself the ability. I call it now the permission to doubt. I was not giving myself permission to doubt until the very bitter end. Yeah. I want to comment on that. The theodicy, the problem of evil, was a huge part of Bible college for me, and I I also felt like the answers were terrible even then. And that beloved theology professor would say that it's an absurdity. And it was his way of saying there is no answer. Looking for answers here is futile, right? And I accepted that for a very long time. But I had very similar experience again that last year reading through the Bible was like, this is bad. This is immoral. And um,
Mm.
stepping ahead, lots of people's stories are having a moral argument, even as children, being 9 years old and recognizing the immorality of Christianity is a pretty common theme that we see in people's stories.
Mm. Now, could you bring us back to your story with the part where with your wife still being a Christian?
Yeah.
Did you feel like, as you were not necessarily at the point of deconversion, but just starting to really think through it, were you free in that context to kind of say, hey, I'm exploring these topics, can we dialogue about it? Or was it like a scary thing where, like, if I even express doubts, this is not going to go very well?
So again, I want to be super clear. I was not admitting to myself that I was doubting and having problems until I was done. And then
Okay.
the minute I admitted it, it was game over.
Mm,
So it was terrifying. So yeah, it took me a couple of months. I've heard other people where they've never told their spouse. So like for me, again, about personal that integrity, I had to be honest with her. Uh, uh, but when I broached the subject, I downplayed it. I was like, I think I'm having some doubts, and it was tears and crying, and it was very painful. Um, Unfortunately, we were near our anniversary, so we had a really terrible anniversary where, uh, you know, she was just deeply hurt, and I knew that, and I was trying to explain to her that, that I loved her regardless of what she believed or did not believe, and I had no intentions of leaving. That I was committed to the relationship. I loved her. That's why I married. Um, yeah, and at the same time acknowledging that I knew I was twisting the knife, right? Like I know I'm hurting you, but I cannot help that. I have to be honest with you. Uh, so I often say, uh, Michelle is amazing. So it went as about as good as it can, but it's bumpy. We basically came to a point where we recognized that we were committing to one another again, kind of a second marriage to the same person in Esther Perel's language, um, because I had changed, because we had changed, and we were recommitting uh, with eyes wide open. Um, I, Most days are great, and every once in a while, the my lack of faith is boiling under the surface in some way or another, and it will come out in an argument here or there, that kind of thing. But again, I think Michelle was amazing in the whole process, and I cannot express enough what a dedicated Christian she is. It's also very personal for her. Um, if she never went to church again a day in her life, she would still be a super ultra dedicated Christian because it's internal for her. It's a personal relationship for her.
mm. Do Christians in general in your life, and at least in your closer circle of loved ones, do Christians talk to you and like ask you, can you tell us, why you left? You clearly knew it was at stake in the sense of hell if they believe that is real, a real outcome for
Mhm.
you. Do they ask you for an explanation, and maybe a similar question, do they try to get you back to say like, you clearly misunderstood something, but let's make this really simple. You need to be saved. Like how do they approach this?
Yeah, I honestly think that I would like the more direct conversation. For me, it was crickets. I had one aunt who very much just like that, lovingly explained to me why, and we had a great conversation, and of course she didn't, accept my answers, but she listened. Uh, my best friend, would listen to me, but I knew I was also hurting him. Like, another thing I think I've learned is I have this whole post about it, that the analogy of the feather, Dumbo's feather, right? Like, for me, when that youth pastor said you could do this, he was giving me the feather to be able to go to Bible college as a high school dropout. And the feather of faith helped me do lots of things in life. And so what I say now is, taking that feather away from somebody by force is violence, is detrimental, it's hurtful to that person. So I have zero desire to deconvert people, right? And so I very quickly realized this is uncomfortable for most of the people around me, and I will wait for them to ask questions, and I'm still waiting. So I think I imagine that several of them believe they know. They think they have reasons that make sense to them that are incorrect, right? They've never really asked me. So, a long story short, no, I had not a lot of engagement on the questions, not a lot of even trying to pull me back, even. Um,
Hmm.
I think maybe because they know how dedicated a Christian I was and how serious it must be for me. And maybe that's charitable, but like I think that's what it is, and that uh, I think there's honest fear that that if we had a real discussion, that that their house of cards would start to fall down. So
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Do you think that they would ever be willing to answer direct questions like, if you were to be speaking to them, saying something like, "Do you think I'm going to burn in hell for what I've done?" And do you think they would take those questions, or would they just say, "I just don't want to talk about it"?
Yeah, I haven't been quite direct about it. I do that with when I interview like an apologist. I do
Right.
that kind of thing, and I think that that's kind of the point, right? Somebody who's prepared for a solid answer that's not just an emotional response. That's
Right.
fair. It doesn't feel fair for somebody that's not trained in theology and like I get the heart of what you're trying to get at is like, what do you really believe? But that is a very, very direct approach. I haven't quite taken that approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. I get the sense, and I totally could be off base with this, but I get the sense that some people truly have like this simple list of things that they do as Christians. They think about this, they do live like this, and they truly like not even like looking at what an atheist would say or argue,
Mhm.
but just even looking at their own scriptures and being able to defend it. Like for example, if you just said, "Look, I don't want to argue is there a God. I just want you to explain to me what did the children of Israel in the Old Testament get commanded to do, all of it, to list out all the things that they were commanded to do to their enemies and to
Yeah.
the slaves. Just list them out and please defend it to me. Just defend your God, or just at
Yeah.
least explain to me what did he do, or just can you please tell me what happens to people who don't end up covered by the blood of Christ when they die? Tell
Yeah.
me what happens to them, and tell me what happens to between a mother and a son, and again, not even arguing and saying, trying to like snip in, snark and like you really think that you're an idiot? Like, no, just speak purely facts. Just give me the facts.
Right.
What do you really think? Um, and I think some of them would, I would hope, be horrified to realize that the words that are coming out of their mouth, not ours, but out of their mouths are, yes, I think you're going to burn in hell. And yes, I think when I'm in heaven, I'm going to be just fine and very happy to be in the presence of the
Yeah.
Lord worshiping while
Yeah.
you're burning or you're annihilated or whatever they believe. And I know, like for example, it's very personal for me with my mom. She can't talk about it much. It's just so painful. But we did have a couple heart to hearts maybe a year after my deconversion, and we're just sitting in a car, and she's like, tears are coming down, and she said, "Yeah, I hate myself. I hate
Mm.
myself because I brought a son into this world who's going to burn in hell." So
Yeah.
there, are you happy? I hate
Yeah.
myself.
Oh man,
And
I'm
she
sorry,
she had,
man.
she hates her life because she's like, I would have, and not just she would say this, but I think she's effectively saying, I wish I would have not brought you into this world, so that, not that she doesn't love me, but just that she could effectively have eliminated my eternal, damnation. It is an interesting thing. Can I ask though, on a similar note, with other thinking about other people around
Mhm.
us? I ask this maybe, I don't do this every time, but maybe every 7 to 10 interviews, I bring up a few examples, and I'll just mention the question, but then I want to put some examples and then
Sure.
pass it to you. Do you think any of them really have any idea of the actual context in the sense of the mythology that was going on at the time of the creation of Christianity? And I mean like this. We know Dionysius for, a couple hundred years before Christ was turning water into wine, and he was riding, the story where he's riding into the town on a donkey. Zeus cries tears that are drops of blood and water. Hermes, the Flash, he walks on water with his golden slippers. Helios, the sun god, he wears a purple robe and he has the crown of the sun rays around his head. Eventually you get the same motifs through Jesus. Do you think that people have any idea that this, like, where they're saying, yes, I get it, like the C.S. Lewis thing where he's like, I get it. I know that the stuff looks similar, but either Satan planted it in advance, like some people try to say, or it's just, this is just God chose to do it this way, and he did choose to use other mythologies, but this is the real one? Or do you think most people are just oblivious, and if they did find out about it, do you think it would make a difference? Or they'd be like, I you can give me 100 examples of how it's just like the other Greek gods, I don't care, Jesus is Lord?
Yeah. I honestly think the last part of your question there is the most profound. So maybe kind of get in order. No, I don't think they do. um, I, I try to be very empathetic about what it was like when I was in, and again that analogy of I'm going to put this on the shelf, right? There's a filtering mechanism that denies anything that is contradictory to the bubble that you are living in, and especially within something specifically Christianity, but specifically a religious context where you're told to only listen to Christian voices, listen to or watch Christian media, read Christian books, uh, you know, it, you know, don't trust science. Don't don't trust the world. You're constantly fed how all of these external things are invalid in one way or another, and so it is exceptionally easy to just ignore that the data that doesn't conform to what you already believe. Again, I'm not angry at Christians. I'm angry at apologists. I think the apologists know what they're doing. They have a conclusion and they go looking for data rather than looking at the data to come to a conclusion. Whereas the normal Christian is just following what they've been told. Uh, and then the last part of your question, I think, is the most important. If they were told this, would it make a difference? I legitimately think that that's a low percentage uh, impact, and this is why I think the mistake that Christians make in evangelism is they think it's a lack of information. People don't know the gospel. Well, that isn't true, especially for people in the Western world. Almost everyone knows what the gospel is, knows the story of Jesus. It is not a lack of information, right? And I feel like we as atheists can make a similar mistake of it's just lack of information. If they knew all of these historical precedents to the gospel story that obviously were borrowed as you do when you are writing something, and in particular hagiographies for theological purposes, right? To raise someone up. And I always like to talk about hagiographies is a technical word, but like a biography, right? When you're watching the biography of Ray Charles, you know that it's not entirely true. There's some embellishment going on here and there, right? Well, that's what's happening in the Gospels, right? So, but my point is that humans have a natural tendency to ignore things that contradict what we believe, and within that Christian bubble, they are being told explicitly to ignore those things, and I don't think that has a high impact. This is, and I guess this is why my personal approach is not the typical, you know, let's do street epistemology, and those kinds of things, because I don't think those things are effective. I think every person has to come to a point where the truth is more important than their belonging to that community, their sense of identity, and that is so deeply personal that in other words, again, the information is out there. You if you're even slightly looking for it, you're going to bump into it. So it's not a lack of information. It is a lack of receptivity to that information. And this has lots of parallels in the political realm as well. Of it's we beat each other over the head with the facts, and the facts are true. The facts are facts, but that rarely changes people's minds. I really honestly think that people have to come to a point where they want change, they recognize change, the need for change, and are willing to then go and see what are the facts, and
Mm.
then it does come crashing down. Then it doesn't take long after that.
It's a good way to put it. You reminded me too of when I was at the pretty much the starting point of my deconstruction, and I was not in any way headed towards deconversion. In my
Yeah,
mind, at that point, I would have said that's almost ridiculous. But I
right.
remember using the phrase with my spouse, just saying, just so you know, just like I don't know where this is leading. I have no like goals with this thought process. I just want to say I am really trying to search for the truth.
Yeah,
And I just want to put this out there like this. I'm more committed to the truth than my current worldview. Hopefully they line up. But if they
right.
don't, I'm more committed to the truth than anything. And I remember the response was like, just like, what are you talking about? Like, that's a horrible statement. Like,
Yes.
that's bizarro world. And
Yeah.
like, I was like, how's that bad? But it's like, it is bad to Christians.
Yeah.
Um, but
Can, can
can
I
I,
can I expound on that
yeah,
too, real
please
quick?
go for it. Yeah.
Prep your next question, but like, uh, that's absolutely what it was for me. I needed it to be true, and truth was more important than anything else. And so when I began to recognize that the truth lay outside of Christianity, um, I was just willing to follow that. Like there was very little qualms to do so. Conversely, I think that within the bubble, within Christianity, they are thinking of truth metaphorically, not in a scientific, rigorous sense of any kind, right? It is God is true. End of conversation. It's all conversation enders, right? It's all ways to not think about how where this leads if you really care about the truth. And so there lots of mechanisms to keep people from actually questioning.
Hmm. On that note, I did a follow-up question that I think is pretty related. If you were to ask someone, say, someone that was a Christian but knows where you stand, and you were to say, look, I'm just curious, not what does and not how did David get to his point of his worldview currently, of his, or the lack of this worldview or whatever. It's where he's at with all the issues that we're talking about with Christianity. But regardless of whether or not they're true, can you tell us if theoretically he has a more accurate perception of the world? What are the ramifications of that?
Mhm.
Um, and where I'm going with this is basically towards the question of nihilism, the idea that we obviously are free to put meaning into our world. We put meaning into our loved ones, our family, the beauty of life, trying to be healthy, creating art, all that stuff, making a difference, leaving the world better than we found it, loving people. um, but at the end of the day, if huge rock slams into the earth in 6 months and we're all gone, did it ever really matter? No, nothing ever. To me, nothing ever really mattered. And honestly, that to me, that's a freeing thought. But I know to Christians, you do get this sense that that thought is not just like a horrible thought, but it's almost a living nightmare. Like if you're telling me that nihilism or some version of it is actually the most accurate way to perceive this world, that this none of this matters and never has and never could, never will. That like almost to the point where some of them I think would probably say, and I've had a few people I think say this, I would rather not live in a world where meaning isn't actually like fixed, where it's just arbitrary or it's not there. I don't want that world. I want
Yeah.
something. And if you're telling me, like, I literally would rather, I mean, I heard to say it this way, but I think some people would almost phrase it this way, hopefully as a tongue in cheek, but or an exaggeration, but to say, I'd almost rather commit suicide than live the way you think. The way you think is truly worse to me than hell.
Right.
What do you think there's any value or truth to that idea that it's just this is like to use another word, it's terrorizing the implication of what if you're right?
Christians don't ask atheist questions because they are afraid that they will lose their reasons for believing and have to deal with that. I want to comment just briefly about nihilism. It's such a misused term, so I want to be super clear here. I think
Sure.
that Nietzsche was talking about, or the existentialists in general were talking about, given that there is no inherent meaning in the universe, given that there is no God, how do we live life in this what appears to be absurd situation, right? And so there's actually quite a bit of meaning in the existentialist of trying to live life and have meaning that they derive from oneself, right? From each other, that kind of thing. Uh, so the way that Christians use the term nihilism is definitely not how I would describe myself. I always say that I have meaning is deeply important. I just think humans make meaning, and I don't think that there is inherent meaning. And I would agree with you. If an asteroid hit 6 months from now, the only thing that would matter is the next 6 months, right? Of us being together. So that is, I think, terrifying for a Christian to ponder, to think about, because especially, and again, I've come to understand this. I think I was spared a lot by becoming a Christian as a late teenager because I kind of had a self identity, had a sense of the world already before I was a Christian. And for people who were raised from birth saying this is your only meaning is that God loves you and you're not worth anything other than that, uh, that is, to the core of that person's being that you are threatening. And so it's a very natural response for them to be defensive and maybe even angry.
Yeah. On a similar note, besides just the whole meaning and purpose of life, the question of the afterlife, do you think that a lot of them just couldn't deal with the issue that you may go nowhere when you die? And, just bring it back
Yeah.
specifically to your story, like, how did you deal with that? Was there angst of like, maybe the scientific questions, like why is there something rather than nothing, but also like there has got to be some, like the whole idea of like how we talk about you deserve this and you're worthy, even atheists use it, and I'm working on some monologues to try to expand on some of why I think this is not helpful to us, but like you deserve love, you're worthy,
Mm.
and it's like, yeah, but worth means there's like someone who's judging the worth, and the
Yeah.
deserve means someone's judging if you deserve it or you don't. Like there is no judge. The afterlife isn't going to take you anywhere for rewards or just for perpetual existence. How did you struggle, or did you struggle with the angst of like, I still do want to live forever? And maybe maybe another question related to it is do you think there's any chance that there's something that does happen after we die, and just where are you with the afterlife topic, and how do you think Christians still see it when with the implications of it all?
Yeah. So let me answer the last question first. I think that we cease being, that when we die, we cease to be. The homeostasis stops, and uh, I do not believe that there is an I that will uh, follow me after death, right after the body dies. And just to put it as plainly as I can. Um, in regard to angst, I know that many people experience hell anxiety long after they have deconverted, long after they've deconstructed, no longer believe in hell, no longer believe in God, etc., and still can still be very anxious. I think for me, again, not having been raised in it, it, it was one of the things that I was deconstructing on the way of, like, heaven. It sounds, too wish fulfillment uh, uh, to me as I was going along. I believed in heaven up to that last minute, but I didn't think that it was probably the way that popular description described. I was also doubtful of near death experience stories. They made me they made me question heaven more than rather than giving me a sense that it was true, because it felt, again, just so, and too convenient in too many ways. Uh, for me, again, the binary was resurrection. I either believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and I was going to be a Christian because nothing else could possibly matter more than that, or the resurrection didn't happen and none of it is true. And so I really just, it was very easy for me to let go of the sense of an afterlife. Um, I don't want to be, uh, I don't want to trivialize that. I've talked a lot about the secular versions of afterlife. Lots of movies and media, particularly like time travel movies about going back to a loved one, are an expression of that same human need. Would I like to be able to go and see my loved ones? Absolutely. I just don't think that's the case. I think that maybe that is a driver for religion to begin with, that the both the loss of people we love and the knowledge that we will someday cease to be, the certain knowledge that we will one day cease to be, is the driver toward religion within humanity. uh, the for the Christians, I think, uh, again, if you've lost a parent or a spouse or a child, which would be terrible. Um, that desire to see that person again is so strong that it would be something that, you would be able to ignore a lot of things in the hope that you would be able to experience that someday. So I am deeply empathetic for why people believe these things. I just no longer do.
Yeah. Did you have to go back and kind of regrieve anybody's passing where you had, well, they were Christian, well, you were a Christian, they had passed, and you had the mental expectation of, yes, they're gone. That's sad for today, but it's not really that sad in the big picture. I'll see them forever. Most likely, if they were saved, at least if they had a profession of faith, they're likely in heaven already. I'll be there someday. We'll be fine. Did you have to regrieve anybody like, oh shoot, like they're just gone? Did that
Yeah.
happen to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about two people. So again, my grandmother died in the mid 2000s, and actually she had made uh, a long trek to come visit me. It's when one of my first children was born, so we couldn't travel. Um, and I actually baptized her at that time. This is a big
Wow.
deal, right? Like, this is a big deal. She was a Christian for sure, but like, she knew it was towards the end of her life. And so, for her comfort, I baptized her. I was there when she died, and I loved her very, very much, right? So yeah, I think I re-grieved, letting go of my grandmother. And then my mom passed away about, um, 8 months, maybe a year. I can't really, like, I don't think I have the timeline in my head right at the moment, but not very long after I deconverted. Uh, and
Mm.
uh, and there was just no, there was no fooling myself. There was no comfort there at all. The funeral was super painful. Had to talk to a pastor. I was very honest. I'm an atheist, and oh, I'm so sorry. Like, very, very patronizing. It was, uh, had I, not been grieving and emotional, I think I would have been much more argumentative, with him at the time. I'm deeply sympathetic for people who lose loved ones and hear very pat answers from, leaders and family, because those pat answers weren't helpful even when I did believe, right? And they are painful now. So, I think the flip side of that is that I also really feel like I truly did grieve my mother. There were no pretensions, and I actually drove her ashes to a favorite beach of hers, and had, uh, very emotional, multiple hours, by myself doing that. And it was very profound and moving, in a way that was meaningful for my mom and I and our very bizarre relationship. uh, but I
Mm.
feel like I got to grieve because I wasn't pretending anymore.
Mm. Wow. That's amazing. My dad passed right before my deconversion, so I haven't had that experience yet. My mom is the only one living of the two, but it definitely, I did go back to just the funeral in my head and kind of relive it, and it is interesting
Yeah,
how you kind of reframe it all. And
yeah,
yeah, I was gonna say I've got a lot of questions up, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna keep moving. I want to go back to a topic you kind of brought up as a side topic, but it was a good point, and you're kind of talking about the idea of, in my words, summarizing what you said, this respect for the fact that some people aren't ready. It's not about facts; they need to take their own time, And it arguably, I took me 43 years to escape
right,
Christianity,
right.
or what I call the Bible prison. Like, why should someone else have to do it in 4 years if it took me 43? Give people time. Having said that, and with the ultimate goal of trying to be as respectful as people's autonomy to believe what they want, the fact is that, like a virus, this thing is never something that it's just me and my personal little cocoon of beliefs. People feel the need, and they're commanded to spread it, and
Yeah,
specifically in a Christian community, to spread it to the next generation, to children. um, to say, if just random person, a single person especially, just wants to go to church, pray to God, tithe, sing some songs, go home, and he feels good about himself, feels honest, feel like he's doing something for the Lord. He's not doing much to spread it necessarily, apart from maybe if someone ever asks him, why are you a good person? No, because of Jesus. But the people that are around children, have kids or around children, their goal very much is to raise little soldiers for Jesus, which of course has to start with the right theology, which of course is, like you alluded to, you are a sinner, you're born in sin, you're a child of Adam and Eve, you've inherited the sin nature, and you've sinned yourself, and your sin is so bad, if you understood it, that if you were the only person that ever lived, Christ would have actually had to come for just you, and he would have. And the punishment literally that you deserved is torture, and Jesus took it. And like in a Catholic church, we actually see the statue of this guy being tortured. Like, that's how bad you are, that people have to be tortured just to rescue you. Um, this comes down to a question of, is this psychological child abuse? How would you respond to that question, and how do you balance the idea of respecting people's beliefs while saying, yeah, but you're actually abusing, like, this, like, not like in a generic sense, like you're actually specifically abusing little children with this worldview?
yeah. So I mean, it's a valid question. I would turn it on its head a bit and say, uh, Christians worry. It's ironic because it's projection, but Christians worry that if atheists gain political power, we will, rain down on them and stop them from being able to worship, right? And the truth is that we're mostly pluralists. We're mostly secular. Secularism means pluralism, which is to say, we're not trying to be authoritarian. We're not trying to tell people what they can and cannot believe. So I'm going to start with that and say it's very tricky territory to tell people how they can raise their children, what they can and cannot believe. I think that's a
Absolutely.
losing battle, that can only be it can only lead to authoritarianism, right?
Yeah.
So uh, within here's what I think makes a difference in the world. I think the fact that I have family and friends who don't ask me questions, they still see me day in and day out, and I'm still the same person whom I presume they thought was a good person back in the day. I'm still that same person. I still care about people. I express that constantly. Uh, uh, in other words, I am out living my life in a way, in a secular way, but that has what they say they have, right? Joy and peace and kindness and all of the fruits of the spirit. And I feel like that's how I live my life. So I think that the most profound impact we can have on the world is that living our lives, being as explicit as we can about our secularism and doing good in the world. Um, I think there's, great. It's really important for, like, let's focus on the United States. We've got several members in Congress who are at least agnostic. Most of them are deeply uncomfortable or, are not out about that fact. We should definitely change that. We should work to, have political change that allows for a politician to take office without a religious test of some kind, which really, in honesty, is how we currently live. I think those are the areas that we ought to focus on. The the individuals and parenting specifically is just fraught. you know, how you're going to have influence on somebody is be that person's friend, be that couple's friend, and be that child's friend. Be a support for that child when the child has questions, without subverting the parents, right? Um, it, in other words, I understand what you're saying. I think it's absolutely right, and I think that I think there's a way of looking at it that it is in fact child abuse. I totally understand that. But then the entire world and all of human history is child abuse, right? So we have to be very, very careful about the language we use around that. Having said all of that, people who go through this deconstruction process, deconversion process, who were those children and now are adults and have the fallout from that, I think they are the ones who have the most to say. That they can talk about, hey, this was my experience, and I think that will have an influence on the world as well. Without saying you're doing this wrong, you can say this is what happened to me, and this is the fallout that I experienced from the hell anxiety I experienced, the rapture anxiety I experienced, um, the sexual dysfunction, the damage of purity culture, what have you. We could go on and on and on, right? Uh, to just be honest about those things, write about those things, be public about those things as much as you're comfortable with, that's going to have an impact on society.
Mhm. Well said. I don't think I could have put that better. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. Just a couple of quick final questions to wrap us up. I wanted, if I could bring our focus in. And by the way, when I'm done these few last questions, feel free to add anything to it that you didn't you wanted to add to it. But your podcast is obviously kind of how I have heard about you in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Again, all just respect for what you're doing, and I think what I mean when I say this, that not everybody is really in a spot where they are free to be that public, to be that out in the open, as you've been doing, to create a platform. Especially, you're going to be on a lot of Christians radars. They're going to
Yeah.
start sending their fiery darts at you, and hopefully a lot of imprecatory prayers. You do get the sense that they want you to fail very much,
Yes. Yeah.
um, but or that they even expect it. But in the big picture, though, you've had the bravery to create a platform that's very public, and I'm sure it costs you a lot of stuff that you could probably talk about that for a while. The ways that it cost you, but starting with the point of, and this is going to be a couple of little aspects of this, so feel free to take them again. I tend to do that. I tend to I think of a question that's really important. I'm like, but I kind of mean it like that, but then like this too and this too.
Yeah.
So pardon me for being long-winded in this, but how did you overcome the idea of like, if you in your marriage are an atheist and you're quiet, you're kind of playing a backseat role in this, that it's not as big a deal. But all of a sudden now within a marriage, mixed faith marriage, so to speak, an unequally yoked marriage, you're no longer just saying there's a disagreement. You're saying I want to be vocal and create a platform. How did you tread those waters, and did that cause an issue? And do your loved ones actually, um, you know, listen? Do they ever tune in, or do they just like, you do your thing, I'm not interested? And what's that journey been like? And then maybe, in the real big picture, just like what caused you to feel the need to start the platform, and what's the purpose and goal of it?
Okay. Yeah, lots of questions there. So yes, it's been a problem, a difficulty. Like, my wife sees me as the anti-evangelist in some ways. I try to frame it to her in that, uh, ironically, it's a lot like ministry, right? It's a lot like, hey, these people are hurt and they need to tell their story, and it's cathartic for them to tell their story, and I'm just really listening. Uh, I obviously agree with them, but like, it's mostly just being present for someone, really listening, and engaging with them. And I think that's deeply meaningful for people. So, I try to frame it as, I believe that I'm helping people. Again, I'm not interested in making more deconverts. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to help the people who have already decided that they're no longer Christians. Um, so that comes up, you know, once in a while, and is a strain on the marriage for sure. The way that one other way that I frame it is, I support her 100% in church, Bible studies, anything that she wants to do. I am 100% behind. I encourage her to do that. I want her to be a part of her community. Uh, and no, there's no judgment. There's no snarkiness. Like I want her to be spiritually fulfilled, for whatever definition of spiritually you want to use.
Hmm.
uh, uh, do they listen to it? Michelle listens to one or two episodes. One was a friend of mine, his wife came on the podcast. And so she was from a Christian married to a deconvert perspective. Uh, Michelle then did my podcast. We did one episode, which I don't think she'll ever do again. But that exists, that's out there. Uh, I had the best friend I've mentioned a few times. I think he's listened to 4 or 5 episodes, that kind of thing. But again, it's contradictory. It's not something that they're going to look towards to listen to. So they have heard, a couple of them have heard a few episodes, that kind of thing. And then the last question, I think, is the one that's really important to me, is why did I start this? Uh, so not you, but many YouTube atheists were when I deconverted. That's the first thing that you find often. It was very debate oriented. It was very hostile, intellectual superiority, kind of a what I call hyper rationalism, kind of a denial of the emotional experience of it all. And even though I talk about my deconversion in quite intellectual terms, it was really an intellectual exercise for the most part. It was also a grieving process, a loss of community, a loss of a sense of the ultimate relationship with God, a loss of, um, potentially friends and family for some people. Some people are shunned entirely. I mean, there's a lot of loss involved. And I was interested in that. I wanted to know the human story of it. And I thought maybe there are some people out here that think like I do, and I had the naivete to just jump into it. And I think the magic of the podcast is what you're doing as well, and what I think makes your show great is people telling their stories is profound, because the listener is going to relate to this wide diversity of experiences, different faith traditions, different trajectories through deconversion, deconstruction, different landing points. I interviewed lots of people who are not atheists, and then lots of people who are. Um, and so I talk about just this spectrum of experience. And when I'm interviewing somebody, even if it's just completely foreign to me, either where they started or where they landed, there are listeners who are going, man, that person's telling my story. And that I think is part of the magic. And I think uh, even better than that is the vulnerability when somebody can tell their story with real honesty, with some vulnerability. That is just really profound and impacts people's lives. So what I hope is that people who are in the middle of these questions, so they haven't decided where they're at, but they're the beginning or the middle, hear some of these stories and know I'm not alone. It's not just me. I'm not crazy for thinking these things. Other people think this too, uh, because that's kind of what you're taught, right? Uh, only fools or evil people, would question this, and here you are questioning it, and so that's a really difficult place to be. So the thing I was trying to get across was you're not alone. Uh, and then the last subject that I don't think we've touched explicitly that I would like to talk about is I also have this conception of what I call secular grace that I think is deeply informed by that experience with the 12 steps and the being around recovering addicts and things. And it's just a radical acceptance.
Mm.
I know the word grace can be traumatizing for people. So like I try to distinguish it from the burden that is grace within Christianity and the dark side that implies that you are not worth anything. So I don't mean it in that way. I mean, the best parts of Christianity are people being good to one another, are being, having potlucks, taking food to somebody who's hurt or injured, helping people with their firstborn child. It's just
Mm.
people being good to other people, and that's what I mean by secular grace. And it's just as secular when a Christian does it as when an atheist does it. It's just people in relationship with one another, in community, meeting each other's needs. And it doesn't have to be hyper spiritualized and blown up into something performance based. It is just being kind to each other. And I know it's just super dull and and derivative and all of those things, and yet it's still, I think, what we need, what people need is back to that nihilism, to know that if you no longer believe, you do not have to be a nihilist, in the Christian sense of the usage of the word. And you don't lose the ability to be kind and giving and loving to one another. And those things are, humans bring that to the story, right? I sometimes say that humanism under other names predates Christianity, right? There was no such thing as quote unquote humanism, but like people being good to each other has existed from the beginning of time.
Exactly.
And Christianity wants, Christian apologists want to say that, all the good things about, civilization are because of Christianity. And I just don't think that's true, right? I think we have grown as human beings to recognize what works for each other, what doesn't. Back to pluralism, right? Pluralism, I think, is a really good thing, even when we disagree. How do we get along and respect the humanity in each other, while also anticipating receiving that respect back?
Mm. Well said. I love it. I feel like that's too. It's also just a big piece of parenting, because you're like, when you're a secular parent, you still have to raise kids that are going to be loving, willing
Yeah,
to share. I mean, the golden rule, like, I was saying even to my own kids today, like, I know that it's hard sometimes to put others first. They have this thing right now where they like literally, like, when we get out of the car, they want to be like, who's first to the front door and in the door. Like, and I was like,
yeah,
guys, like, you got to say to yourself, what would make the other person feel so happy inside and thrive, and say, oh,
yeah,
you really want to get in the door first? Okay, I'll put you in front of me. You can go first, I'll go last.
yeah,
And but that's, you could say that's, some of that's, certainly parallel to some biblical concepts, but it's like, you do have to have that secular grace, and in a parenting is chock full of that, it feels like, for me.
yeah.
um
Yeah, I know we didn't get into kids. I think that's a huge topic. Kids are where the rubber meets the road. They like in my case, the unequally yoked, they would poke at that, push at it, and, and try to work it to their advantage. And, you really do see the full spectrum of human nature when you have, particularly siblings, with each other. And yeah, you're responsible to make them good humans in the world and, how to treat each other well and treat the world, the people that they come into contact well. And that's a challenge.
It is. It is. Well, could I ask as we wrap up, if somebody wanted to consider coming on your podcast, how should they both, reach out to you and kind of start the vetting process to see if they'd be a good candidate to work with you for your interviews?
Yeah. Really email. I'm old school. Email is the best way. So gracefulatheist@gmail.com. I am on the various social platforms. I try to pay attention to them as I can at Graceful Atheist on most of them. But email is definitely the best way to get my attention.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I know we're out of time here, but I just want to say again, where I started, thank you for what you're doing. I mean, this is where it's at. And I completely agree that a lot of this is, it's not as just of an intellectual journey for us. There's so many emotions and so much, angst and just that sense of like, what do I do now with my life? And, who's going to hate me for this? And just there's such a bigger part of this than just, the facts of ancient history or whatever, or of science. It's like there's a real human journey to this. And I so appreciate the fact that you're bringing that to people's attention, because for a lot of people, it really is not, like you said, about information. There's so many more nuances and levels to this. And to feel in the mix, like number one, you're not alone, like you said earlier. And number two, there's good reasons for deconversion. But number three, like it's going to be weird. It's going to be painful. Even if no one hates you for it, even just you alone, it's going to be painful. It's going to be very, weird. Like when Neo escapes the Matrix and
Yeah,
then gets explained, like, what is it? Oh, you're just a battery, and he throws up. It's like, this is really weird. It will throw you for a loop. The carpet's being pulled out. But at the end of the day, take a deep breath. It will be okay. And it will get better. I ask this question of a lot of people on my podcast, but I say contrast the peace. And almost everybody says the peace, honestly, is just as great, if not much greater, on this side of deconversion. And just to encourage people that are going through it, maybe where they're kind of in that harder part of it, trust me, it does get better. Take it one day at a time, but
yeah,
you will get settled, and you'll feel strong again, and you will have community that will come around you and love you through it.
absolutely. I quote Jesus all the time. The truth will set you free. It really will.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'll wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with David Ames of the Graceful Atheist podcast. David, thank you so much. Great to get to know you, and look forward to doing it again sometime.
Thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate the chance to come and talk to your audience.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a good night.